Hello, and welcome to Historical Geography in the Holy Land. This is Unit 2 of our course. And so today we'll be focusing on architecture of New Testament times. The topics we'll be covering in this presentation are civic layouts, water installations, entertainment structures, religious structures, domestic structures, and then we'll conclude with a summary. So you might be curious as to why we're focusing on the architecture of New Testament times. Well, it's important to understand and help us better contextualize the world that not only Jesus, but the apostles would walk through as they moved and spread the word of God and the good news of the gospel, and why it was so effective in being able to spread out so rapidly and change the world in the manner that it did within 300 years. When we think about how things evolved with Constantine declaring the Roman Empire to be a Christian society versus one that was pagan. So what are all the things that went into play to make this possible? God steps into human history at certain moments of time to effect specific kinds of changes. So let's take a look now at what the world looked like during the time of Christ. Throughout the Holy Land, we see evidence of Hellenistic and Roman influence in the design and the layouts of the cities. In the Hellenistic cities, the most significant structures and cultural institutions of Greek-based cities are also found during the Roman period. So you have what results in a phenomenon which we recall called the Greco-Roman city. The Roman Empire understood that the government of the provinces is best performed through the cities, because that's where you're going to have the most control. So the more people you have in the cities, the better control you have of your population. You don't want a lot of people out in your villages, along your borders, causing rebellions and fomenting all sorts of strife. So you want to get as much of the population into areas where you can easily take control of. There are about 1,000 cities in the Roman Empire. Most of them relate to the New Testament era. And many of the cities were Greek cities before Romanization. The Hellenistic city conforms to a standard type. And let's take a look at the Roman Empire before I talk about that. You can see how expansive the Roman Empire is. And so Hellenistic cities would have been in this portion of the world, when we think about the Middle East and the influence that it had. And then the Romans come in and take over all of this area and add to what was there, and also expand, including what they think a city should look like. So Hellenistic cities conform to a standard type. They have a network of uniform rectangular blocks and at least one open space which is set aside for the agora, which is known as the marketplace. And you'll also find public buildings in the marketplace. At least one of the longitudinal streets within a city is wider than the rest, and it's usually referred to as Straight Street. We think about Straight Street in Damascus, and a reference to it in the book of Acts, chapter 9, verse 11. That geometric style of formal city planning was actually taken from the Persian Empire, dates back to the 6th century BCE, and it has significant impact and influences the western part of the empire. So here we have an example of a Greek city, Athens. You can see here you have the agora, the marketplace. The Roman cities continue along the Greek format. However, religious superstition plays a key role when they're locating and founding and dedicating a new Roman city. So they look at what are the religious factors, the gods that are going to help make this city prosper. Cities were constructed as squares. One of the lines becomes a central axis of the city. And so you have surveyors, engineers who are very focused on developing these cities. And it leads to the development of geometry, the ability to measure and survey the earth. Roman military camps setups have a setup that's very similar to the cities. The use of squares in the set of the city. So here's a Roman city plan. You can see all these squares, how things are divided up into portions. It's very specific locations. So the use of the squares are significant in how they set up the city. So there are 25 Roman feet to each side, and that ends up dividing out into 100 small areas known as centuries. And so this process of dividing things up into these smaller squares is called centuriation. Cities are generally set up so they have a north-south orientation with that central street called Cardo Maximus, and that's their main street. So there's an emphasis on compass orientation. The Romans have pragmatic concerns about which way the wind is going to come, which way there's going to be drafts. They're thinking about not only the streets, but the sewage system. Versus a Greek city tends to focus on beauty and accessibility. Roman cities focus on centralization and axial planning. All the major arteries, in other words, the roads, were also ornately decorated with colonnades. So here you have that Roman military camp with the centuriation. Here you have an example of Cardo Maximus. And now in front of you have the map of Madaba. So the map of Madaba is an index map of the region dating back from the 6th century Common Era, and it's actually preserved in the floor of the Greek Orthodox Basilica of St. George, which is located in Jordan. It was originally made with over 2 million pieces of colored cut tile and stone. The map depicts for us the hills and valleys and also the villages and towns of Israel and in the Nile Delta area. So you're just seeing a very small portion of this very large map. This mosaic map provides for us one of the earliest representations of Byzantine Jerusalem, which we know is the Holy City. And so it gives us very important landmarks of this 6th century. And you can see the Cardo Maximus here, okay? And here we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that central Cardo Maximus, you can see is lined with columns. So the map was key in developing scholarly knowledge about the physical layout of Jerusalem after its destruction in 70 CE by the Romans and what it looked like after it was rebuilt. So here we have another example of a Cardo Maximus Main Street, and this is in the Roman city of Jerash, also in Jordan. Because of the strength of the Roman legions, defense is not a consideration in the location and layout of cities. So they don't have to worry about walls that need to be built generally, because there really isn't anyone out there who can defeat the Roman Empire at this time. What is significant for them is communication. So cities tend to be located by natural harbors, at river crossings, and by areas of land which are rich in agriculture, because they need to be able to provide food for their population. Water is not so much a problem as it would have been several hundred years ago, because they use the aqueduct system to bring water in from long distances. The Romans are also very politically savvy and astute. they're focusing on addressing the needs of the population in the cities. So they also want to make sure that when they build their cities, they locate them in areas where there's enough room for them to expand to provide entertainment, such as the different theaters, coliseum, and hippodromes. Now we're going to look at some of the civic structures that we find in the Roman city. So at the heart of every Greco-Roman city, we find the agora, the marketplace. The Romans called the agora the forum, and it's a place they set aside for public functions. Note now the Roman city blocks are squares versus the forum is rectangular. So that's the opposite of what we saw in a Greek city. The forum is colonnaded and it can be covered. And it's considered to be the center of Roman public life. So you have speeches and shops and processions, all sorts of events that take place at the forum. The forum also has an underground area with vaulted corridors, and it provides a covered passage, an area of shops that offer protection, can protect the shops and the people from the weather and the element. Some of the larger cities, such as Ephesus and Smyrna, they actually have two forums. One is for commercial use, and the other is for state use. So here we have the Roman Forum, the remnants of the Roman Forum. You can see the different, how everything is colonnaded. This one is in another image of it. Very dramatic. Basilicas are built when the city actually outgrows the forum. And many cities would build a basilica. It's a royal house, and they locate it near the forum. So the basilica is a colonnaded building that's used as a covered marketplace. It's a place where people could conduct business out of the weather. The basic design of the basilica is that of a long rectangular building, and it has a central nave and side aisles. The same architectural style can be found in Jewish synagogues and Christian churches of the first century, Common Era, and later. It's a style which can accommodate large crowds. Now, the Christian basilicas have only one entrance, and it's on the narrow side of the building. They usually also have an annex or an apse, which is a semicircular projection, and you'll find that on the east end. And that provides a symbolic connection between the resurrection morning and the rising sun. So here you have an example, a model of the basilica. You can see the inside, the central aisle and the two side aisles, and then you've got that apse. Here's an interior view. Many of our ancient cathedrals throughout Europe are built on this basilica style. Some ruins of a basilica. And here's a good view of an apse, that semicircular round protrusion that would be found in a basilica. Another building is the bema. Now the bema is used for official functions of government, such as when judicial duties are being performed, and then tribunals are also conducted within the bema. That term bema can also refer to the tribunal platform, such as when Paul testifies in Corinth on top of the bema in the book of Acts, chapter 17. Another type of building which is constructed near the forum is the Senate chamber, the bouleuterion. It's generally taller and statelier and more grand than the basilica. It's often the highest building in a city because it's there to represent and symbolize the rule of Rome in the provinces. So here you have an example of the bema in Corinth. This is where it's thought that Paul would have stood and given his speech. Here we have the bouleuterion. So that's that judicial building where court takes place, tribunal hearings. Now we move into the water installations. So in Greece, bathhouses were found. They, began with the concept of the bathhouses. It's something that the Greeks used, but it was much more expanded upon by the Romans. So Greeks generally bathed in cold water, and they did it specifically for cleanliness. It wasn't a place of indulgence where you went to soak and luxuriate. Bathing was done at key points in their life where you were required to take a bath. Like when a baby's born, you bathe it. And then at marriage, and then also at death. Now, we're going to assume that they bathed more frequently than that, but you definitely did it at those key events. During the time of the philosopher Homer, warm and frequent bathing was actually considered a sign of luxury and something that a woman would do. It was considered a weakness, an effeminacy. In contrast, when we look at the Roman baths, every Roman city in the empire had one or more bathhouses. The first one built in Rome was actually by the Emperor Marcus Agrippa. Well, he wasn't emperor yet. He worked with, he was a deputy to the Emperor Augustus. And then by 33 BCE, before the Common Era, there were 170 baths built in Rome. By the 4th century, they had nearly 1,000. So baths and bathhouses and bathing were very popular among the Roman people. They ended up combining bathhouses and the gymnasium, which was an educational and a cultural establishment and an athletic center. So it became a meeting area for many different things that take place, the bathhouses along with the gymnasium. And needless to say, the Roman bathhouse was far more developed than the Greek. Now, in order to have an efficient and an effective bathhouses, they included hot springs, thermae, and this had a very, big appeal to the masses, and it allows for personal hygiene when you have all these people crammed in a city, and it was a form of recreation for the poor because it was a place of social gathering. It was very cheap. It only cost 1 Roman quadrant in order to use the bathhouse. So what's a quadrant equivalent to? Well, if you remember the story of the widow in the temple in the New Testament and how she gave her entire treasure as her tithe, she had 2 mites. And so 2 mites equals a farthing, and that's the equivalent of a Roman quadrant. Now, Roman bathhouses became a symbol of 1st century luxury, to the point that the Emperor Caligula actually banned the use of the bathhouse during religious holidays because he didn't want everybody in the bathhouse. He wanted them paying attention to the temples and supporting them because that was one way the empire got money. So he would actually have the bathhouses closed during religious holidays. Now, bathhouses in general were open from sunrise to sunset, and the most popular time for them was attending a bathhouse was during midday and evening. There were actually separate facilities for men and women. Each contains, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely, and some of the bathhouses actually had hot air rooms for sweating, which we know to be saunas. And that's something that you find later in the Turkish baths, the hammam. And we have examples of that in Palestra and Sudatoria. So in the Roman bathhouse, we have several different rooms. First, they had separate facilities for men and women, and each of them had their own dressing room, which is called the apoditerium. And so you would enter into there and undress and then come back, dry off, and redress again. Then you would go to these various rooms for bathing. You would go to the frigidarium, which had cold water. Then you'd move to the tepidarium, which has warm water. And then finally, the last room you would enter is the caldarium, which is the hot pool. Mixed bathing was forbidden until the time of the Emperor Hadrian, when women who participated in the Olympic Games were also then allowed to come in and get massaged with that hot olive oil rub downs. And those rub downs were apparently applied by men. So there was women's reputations tended to get compromised with these mixed bathing rooms. And it actually led to grounds for divorce, which was approved by the Christian Emperor Justinian. So what you see before you here is the Roman bathhouse, which is actually located in Rome, and it's beautifully maintained. It's a fascinating archaeological site to visit. This is the interior of the bath layout, and you can see the women have separate dressing rooms, warm room, hot water room. Men have a sauna. You can see where the furnaces are to run the hot water beneath the pools. This is the kind of brickwork that they used that underlaid the entire bathhouse, and that's how they brought the steam and the hot water through. So this would be what runs underneath the flooring. So that's what you're looking at here. Here's another example of the remains of a Roman bathhouse. And notice the aqueduct to bring the water in. In contrast to the Roman bath, we have the Jewish bath, which is referred to as a mikvat. And these are ritual baths, so they're all about purity. They're designed specifically in order, based on Jewish law, the necessity to go through ritual purity and bathing before you enter into the holy presence of the Jerusalem temple, God's house, and in order to be clean. There are references to the Mishnah, which is the Jewish law. So in the Mishnah, we find such wording that the pool must contain living water, and that refers to running water. It's water that can't be hand-drawn, but is supposed to be brought in from a natural source. In fact, early Jewish and Christian baptisms were done in the same manner, in other words, using running water. These mikvats could hold 60 gallons of water with a depth of 5 feet, because you were to fully immerse yourself when you entered into the Jewish mikvah. The bathhouses, the Jewish bathhouses, we find them built in Judea during the Herodian period, following the same basic pattern of Roman bathhouses. So later on, under Herod the Great, he's going to build these bathhouses. Also, the very wealthy Jews would have a mikvah and their own private Roman bath in their homes. So it's fascinating to see this in the homes of the very wealthy. In both Masada and Jerusalem, there are several large pools which were built in order to accommodate the masses when they came, so that they could go through the mikvah in order to participate in the religious ceremonies. So here's an example of a mikvah. Now remember, this would have been a covered building, so you're looking at an archaeological remain. And so when you enter a mikvah, you would enter in one side, immerse yourself 3 times, reciting the Psalms, and then you would come out on the opposite end and dress in all clean clothes. So it's totally purified. You would touch nothing on the side that you entered in versus the side you exit. This is a mikvah at Qumran, and the damage here that you're seeing is from earthquake damage. This is one of the very large mikvahs in Jerusalem, and so many people could enter into the mikvah in order to bathe so that they could enter into the holy temple. So you can think of events at Passover where so many pilgrims are coming in and are anxious to enter into the holy grounds. So they need to go through the mikvah ritual so they can be purified. So with all these baths and all these people, you're going to need water. So how do you bring the water in? Well, the Greeks developed an aqueduct system. It was very simple. They used rectangular channels. They cut it into the rock, or they made it out of solid rock. The Romans took this and expanded on it. And so they built extensively, so that by the late 4th century BCE, it became, aqueducts were just part of everyday life. It was an essential part for the Roman Empire. When the empire replaced the republic, which is around the time of the birth of Christ, that need for water expands with the rise in population and also the use of baths. The Claudian aqueducts were a keystone to the water system during the New Testament period. They're much larger in height, and they can hold a lot more water. And so these aqueducts were built by the Emperor Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Each of them improved Rome's water system. There's an aqueduct that's actually built by Herod the Great. You can see remnants of it that ran to Caesarea Maritima, the port city he built, and parts of it are still standing. That was approximately 13 miles long. Water flowing through the aqueduct system is normally delivered to what they call a castellum divisorium. It's a reservoir which has settling basins. And there's a system of sluices for distribution of the water throughout the city. There are also secondary water towers built to ensure that there's an adequate water supply. Now, private citizens pay a tax for water to participate in accessing this public system. By the 4th century BCE, there are over 1,352 sites where water is available in the Roman Empire. Now, the drainage system for this water system it's underground, and it actually runs beneath the paved streets. So it's right down the center of the paved streets, and these sewers, these covered sewers, are called cloacae, and they're so large that covered wagons with hay could actually drive through them. The water itself, the Romans, the way they engineered this is fascinating. It's moved by gravity, and so it follows the contour of the land. And something I'm not sure everybody realizes, that much of the aqueduct system actually runs below ground. So what you see above ground is just a small portion of the extensive aqueduct system, and they covered it to make sure the dirt and it stayed relatively clean. So here you have some examples of Roman aqueducts, and you'll see remains of this all throughout Europe. The different arches that are used in the Roman aqueduct system. This is some of the sections of the aqueduct that Herod the Great built that you can find in Caesarea Maritima. It's enormous and overwhelming. I mean, if a real person is here, is much smaller, you can see the scale of just how large this is and how massive. So how are we going to entertain these masses now that we're making sure that they've got water, they've got food, because they're planned, the cities are located to agricultural centers. You have a way of bathing them and keeping them clean. So there are different forms of entertainment, one of them being the theaters. Now, Greek theaters were an important part of urban life in the New Testament era. There were lots of plays. However, few have actually survived from the Greek times. We have some from Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, Aristophanes and Neander, and those are complete plays that we have, but a lot has been lost. So theater began as a form of religious drama. In fact, everything Greek developed from the context of religion. So traditionally, the theaters were constructed with the temples and was part of the sacred precincts. For example, the theater in Pergamon connects with a terrace to the Forum and the Temple of Dionysus. There are three types of drama in the Greek theater. We had tragedy, comedy, and satire. And all tragedy had to do with religious concerns. The actual Greek theater building has three components. You have the orchestra area, which is a very large space, and that was where the chorus was that were doing all the dancing and the singing. Then you have the theatron, which is where the spectators would be sitting. And then you had the skena, which is the stage or the scene for the building. Theaters were large enough to handle most of the population of a city. So, for example, Ephesus could seat 20,000. In fact, they ended up building a second theater because the city grew so much. During ancient times, only one actor would appear in a performance, and he would be responding to the chorus. Over time, the actors expanded, and the chorus loses its importance. Now, if you were showing a comedy required staging with backdrops, and comedies reflected the world of ordinary people. And so we find theater architecture begins to change, excuse me, as it loses religious characteristics. It becomes more secular with the growing popularity of comedy. The stage also sometimes has wings, referred to as a periskena, making it larger. And then in order to expand the acoustics, they would add these bronze vases as reverberators, and that would help increase the acoustics the further up they went. We'll take a look at some theaters now, and they would set these theaters in very dramatic locations along hillsides to best capture the acoustics, and of course the scenery, the views are incredible. So here's an example of a layout of a Greek theater. So here's a theatron. This is where the audience sits. This is the skena, this is the stage, and notice the size of the orchestra. So this is where the dancing and the singing takes place, and you have one actor responding. And these are the side wings, the paradoxa. Here's a model of a Greek theater. Again, notice the circle, your chorus area. And notice how small the stage is relative to the theater itself and the chorus. This is the Greek theater in Delphi. And you can see the drama of the scenery, but the acoustics as it's built and surrounded by these mountains is incredible. Then we have Roman theaters. Now, Roman theaters developed later, obviously, and they have a bad reputation among the conservative citizens because religious drama is replaced with comedy. They weren't approved by the conservative citizens because a lot of times they were lewd and they made fun of the conservatives, actually, and life in general. They're also frequently connected with the games and other events that would occur during state religious festivals. Conservative Romans actually viewed the acting profession with disfavor, and they felt that it had degenerated so much that only slaves ended up going to watch the theater. All actors in the theater were males at this time in history. Now, the Roman type theater was modified, did a modification of the Greek, and they would normally use the Greek theater and just make the modifications along the way. When new ones were built, they tended to follow the Greek style. If possible, they would build it into hillsides, such as we saw at Pergamon. However, if it was a totally pure Roman theater, and depending on the city, it would be built from the ground up, and they would place it near the heart of the city, and they'd use it for multiple things. So they'd not only use it for theater, but they'd also use it for civic gatherings and the assembly of citizens. For example, when we had Paul preaching in Ephesus in the book of Acts. Now, the Roman changes to Greek theaters included the orchestra being reduced to a semicircle and the stage being extended from one side of the seating all the way to the other side. So it was a much larger stage. There was also an elaborate seating system, which was based on sex, age, profession, and rank. Then the entrance of the theater shifted to the rear versus the parodi, which was toward the front of the Greek theaters, those wings on either side of the stage. And they also included awnings, which they were able to spread over the theater in inclement weather to protect people from too much sun or rain. So here you have the Roma Theater. Now look at the size of the stage, how much it's expanded, and notice how small that orchestra area has become. Here's a layout of the Roman Theater. This is the Roman Theater at Caesarea Maritima. And some of these ancient theaters are still used today, as you can tell from the setup here. The Odia, or the Odeum, or the Odeon, is a type of theater which is devoted to musical productions. It's also used as for rehearsals and performance. It's like a performance hall before a production. And it's generally a multi-purpose type of auditorium. It's located near the actual main theater. Another building or facility that's used for the entertainment of the masses is the Hippodrome. And it's here at the Hippodrome that we have the famous chariot races. Romans enjoyed brutal games, and this increased toward the end of the Roman Republic and the growth of the empire. They became obsessed with gladiatorial games. In fact, most of the emperors except Tiberius actually supported the gladiatorial games. One of their most popular sports is the chariot races. They also have boxing, wrestling, and acrobatics. The Hippodrome is a place where the horses are run. Another name for the Hippodrome is a circus. So the famous circus is that circus that we know, Circus Maximus in Rome. It actually seated about 60,000 during the time of Emperor Augustus. By the time of Constantine, it had been enlarged to seat 200,000 people. Now, these circus events tend to stir up the mobs. It's also a location where many of the Christians were martyred before the time of Constantine. So here's an aerial view of a model of what the circus or the hippodrome would have looked like. So all around here is seating, and this is the course where individuals would be running. In regards to Christian martyrdom, they would let animals loose and they would kill and savage the Christians. They would roll the Christians in tar and light them up. There's horrific things that would take place here. And of course, then they had also their chariot races. This is the remains of an actual hippodrome that's located in Caesarea Maritima. So now you're looking at the long view of the remain of the hippodrome in Caesarea Maritima. And here you can see where the audience would have sat, part of the remains of the actual circus. Amphitheaters are freestanding oval-shaped structures which completely surround the arenas. So they're built specifically for the Roman games. Now, it's just as a side note, the origin of the gladiators came from the country of Etruria, and they began as funeral games that were played out to honor the dead heroes. and they were introduced into Rome around the time of 264 before the Common Era. So when they built these amphitheaters, the arena section is actually sunk low below ground level, and you enter on either side. And this arena can actually be sealed off and filled with water so they could have mock navy battles taking place, in addition to the gladiator games. These bloodthirsty games eventually led to the degeneration and the moral decline of the Roman Empire. The games were horrific. They showed that to the Romans there was no value to human life. It was cheap. Murder was justified by the belief that these people deserved to die. Now, the popularity of the amphitheater leads eventually to the abandonment of the theaters themselves. The theaters were again where plays were taking place. And it was the Christian gospel that finally brought an end to the games in the amphitheaters. And it was brought to an end by the Christian emperors. In 326, Constantine stopped the supply of gladiators. And then Honorius in 404 forbid gladiator combat. So no more death of criminals by beasts, or the persecution of Christians, or just this incredible waste of human life to these gladiator games. So here's the famous Roman amphitheater, the Colosseum. You see, this whole arena could actually be filled with water, and that's where they would have their mock battles. Otherwise, the gladiators were down here, and all around them are the masses. And the seating, many parts was all covered, so you could, be protected from the wind and the sun and the rain. And if you have the opportunity to visit the Colosseum in Rome, they have there's a museum that's inside of here, and it shows you how it was built and talks about the history. So what do the religious structures look like at this time? We'll start with the synagogues. Synagogues are religious, cultural, and social centers of the Jewish community, and they're found in every settlement of the Roman and Byzantine period. That term synagogue refers to a gathering of people. It's not just an institution or a building. If you visit Masada and Herodium, they have synagogues, and they date to the reign of Herod the Great. And what they actually are renovated parts of the building, such as the dining halls that have been made into a synagogue area. Many of the synagogues that have been excavated in Israel are from the 3rd century Common Era and later, when they actually began to build buildings just as synagogues. Right. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so we have different types of synagogue structures. In Galilee during the Byzantium period, Jewish culture was actually thriving because of their different commercial skills and ability to grow and participate in commerce. So what you had was that in the lower Galilee area, you had beautiful, very lavish synagogues with extensive use of colored mosaic on the floor. But then if you look at synagogues in the upper Galilee area, you find a far more conservative synagogues than what you see in that lower area. So there are what we believe, based on the excavation, 4 different types of synagogue structures that we find. The prototype is the reused buildings, such as I talked about in Masada, where you would reuse a dining hall and make it into a synagogue. So that would be the 1st century Common Era that we're talking about. Then the early synagogue buildings were along the Galilean or the basilica style of building. And those date to the 2nd and 3rd century Common Era. And you find examples of that in Capernaum in the rectangular buildings. The flooring is more simple, it's a flagstone flooring. They tended to have 3 entrances with the short side entrance facing Jerusalem. And they were very simple with no decoration. So you don't find those expansive mosaic floors. Another style is the transitional synagogue, and they're built along the broad house format. They date to the 4th and 5th century, and they're oriented toward Jerusalem with mosaic flooring. Then late period synagogues include the apse, so they refer to them as apsidal. They have that basilica design, but they have an apse, and that would be facing Jerusalem. And again, you find mosaic flooring. Many later synagogues are a combination of features in both the upper Galilee and Golan area. Again, those date to the 4th and 5th century. In general, we have very little remains of synagogues from the New Testament era. Our best examples are found in Herodium and Masada, where we have those dining halls converted into synagogues. Throughout most of the New Testament period, synagogue gatherings tended, particularly in small villages, were probably held in private homes, which is the same for early Christian assemblies. And Jesus taught that worship of God takes place irrespective of geography and religious architecture. So here we have a synagogue in Capernaum, which is by the house of St. Peter. In regards to Christian churches, well, since Christianity was not a legal religion in the time of the early empire, Christians couldn't corporately own any property. So gatherings actually took place in homes or in rented rooms. Now, there's evidence that early Jewish Christians continued to meet in synagogues, and we see that in the book of James, chapter 2, verse 2. And then later on, churches began being built specifically as churches during the reign of Constantine, starting in 306 Common Era. With the start of the Byzantine Empire during that 4th century, Christian influence dominates. And so you find that basilica-type church buildings are being found all over the Mediterranean world, especially in sacred sites. In the Holy Land, we find over 200 Byzantine churches which have been excavated. One of the things that Constantine did is once the empire became Christian, he had his mother Helena go to these holy sites, sacred sites throughout Israel, and build these basilica-style churches over them, or shrines, in order to mark this site and encourage the gathering of the people to worship and also make these sites pilgrimage sites. She was a key figure in leading this program. So here we have an early excavation of a church. This is the Dura Europos, which is considered the oldest, earliest Christian church, the excavation site that you're looking at here. And so you can see an aerial view of the excavated site. The Church of the Nativity, and it's in the traditional basilica style with the central nave and the apse, and then you see the aisles. And in those days, people would come and stand so you could get large masses into the building. Now, during the New Testament era, the majority of the people were pagans who believed in polytheism and idolatry, as noted in and Mark and John, they pointed out the differences in religious worship between pagans, Jews, and Christians. Now, temples are common, therefore, throughout the ancient world, and they tended to be located near the center of the city, the Acropolis. Now, temples were not places of worship, but they were considered to be the residences of the gods. And because of that, the gods had to be placated with the very best. So temples are built of huge cut stones laid out on foundations of bedrock. So they're not going to move and be demolished. You want to make and appease the gods, so you want to give them the very best that you can. There were many different temple styles, and the columns would reflect, again, Greek architecture. The earliest column style is the Doric. That dates to the 8th century before the Common Era. Then you have the Ionic, 6th century, and the Corinthian, which is the 5th century. The temples that are dedicated to Emperor Augustus would use the Corinthian style columns. So here you have the famous Parthenon in Greece. Notice all the temples. So remember, it's not a place of worship. It's a place that was made for the god, in the presence of the god. This circular structure becomes very popular with Herod the Great when we study him in our next class. So what about the people? Where are the people living? So we have many villas and palaces. The homes built for the wealthy citizens during the New Testament times are the best preserved examples of the period, and we have them as artifacts. Why? Because they were able to afford to build using large stones, which tend to be enduring, versus the poor people would be building their homes from dried bricks, clay, small field stones, and those fell apart over time and got reused for other buildings. So there are palatial dwellings found throughout the Roman Empire. Herod the Great built a major palace on the western side of Jerusalem. He also builds a desert palace in Jericho. He has beautiful fortresses throughout many Judean cities. And Roman officials liked living in elegant quarters. We find them in the Praetorium at Caesarea Maritima. So here we have the remnants of the palace, of Herod's palace. This is his winter palace in Jericho. Notice the circular shape here. That's actually part of his ancient Roman bathhouse that he had built into his palace. Wealthy citizens built luxury homes in the best parts of the city. We actually have a house in the upper city of Jerusalem, and it has, it's been excavated, and it has extensive bathing facilities. It has both a Roman bath and a couple of mikvahs. We found remnants of the utensils and stone potter and stoneware, showing that they could afford the expensive stoneware versus the clay pottery. Stoneware, actual stoneware could be cleansed and purified, so you didn't have to keep breaking it up and bringing in new pure vessels for the different Jewish holidays and festivals. So these homes tended to be occupied by the nobility. That would include the high priest at the head of the Sanhedrin. So it's believed that the Sadducees lived in these homes. They would be closest to the temple precincts. Another house was discovered that covered nearly 2,000 square feet belonging to a wealthy family, and it actually had 2 ritual baths, a mikvah, showing, and its own private Roman bath, showing again the need for ritual purity, and the fact that it had 2 mikvahs would indicate that it would have belonged to a Sadducee. Nearby to these ancient houses was discovered a smaller house covered in ashes and soot. and it's called the Burn House. It survived the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE by the Romans. And when they excavated the house, it's actually now a museum. If you go to Old Jerusalem, you can visit this site. It's beautiful. And they run a video showing what the last days and the moments in Jerusalem would have been like for this family. The walls are covered in thin plaster. It has a dirt floor. It has many different ovens, and they think it was probably a workshop for maybe a larger residence. Dining rooms are found in middle and upper class homes of the Roman Empire. Poor homes don't have dining rooms. And generally, a dining room has couches or benches, 3 to 6 of them, depending on the size of the room itself, would surround a table in a U shape, and the room itself is called a triclinium. And the posture during dining is one of reclining. When we think of John chapter 13, verse 25, he talks about this. The poor people who want to host a lot of folks for an event will actually rent or borrow dining facilities, as noted in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 14, verse 15. So here we have an example of a triclinium. These stone benches would have been covered with softer rugs and pillows and bedding of some kind so that you could lounge against them, and the table would be down the center. This is from Pompeii. It was very well preserved from a very wealthy household. You can see from the mosaics and the frescoes on the wall. And it was very large, so many people could sit around this dining room. Homes of the middle and the lower class, there's very few of them that are found due to their flimsy construction. However, recent excavations in Capernaum found what they feel would be the house of Simon Peter, and it was found with other similar houses like it. And this is in a village, and this house would have been was built of stone. It has a central courtyard. There were no windows to the outside. So the rooms itself, they would have had little light, but they were secure against the elements. And so in order to find anything, you would have to light a lamp, as noted in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 15. So what you're looking at here is the Church of St. Peter, which has been built over the remains of St. Peter's house. And if you go into this beautiful church, not only do you see the Sea of Galilee, but the floor is made of glass, so you can look down into the house of St. Peter. Now, St. Peter's house is one of the homes that Queen Helen located and designated as a holy spot. And so she built a rectangular, it's an octagonal shape that she built over these sites. And when the excavations took place, they actually found that octagonal shape and then the house itself. So soon after the death and resurrection of Jesus, people realized that something phenomenal had happened. And so they began to gather at Peter's home. And eventually so many people were gathering that the home became an early church, a gathering place for the early Christians. And there's actually graffiti from that time saying Jesus was here, St. Peter lives here, along the walls. Rooms are used for both storage and sleeping in the homes of the middle and the lower class. And in the summertime, people would live and sleep on their rooftops because there's no air conditioning, and that's the way you could get some kind of a breeze. And we have references of Simon Peter as he's praying on the roof. And so again, this validates what we read in the Bible. And that reference is found in the book of Acts chapter 10. If a person had enough money, they would dig a cistern underground to make sure that they were able to store extra water. So they would collect the rainwater. That way they would have water during periods of drought. These homes did not have any indoor toilet facilities. So they would either use public facilities at a minimal cost or use their environs, the local environment around them. Bathing is for the middle class and the poor was done in pools, streams, or public bathhouses if they had access to them. The poor generally sleep on straw mats or animal rugs on floors of beaten earth. In Roman-style homes, they would have a small bedroom with bedsteads made of laced rope for a bed frame. So here's an example of a public toilet, and this is from Ephesus, and it was a social gathering place. And here you have where a channel for fresh running water would run. Now, in contrast to what you find in the villages, in the cities, you had apartment houses. Now we know that the Apostle Paul travels north through the city, so he's able to see how the housing changes from that in the Levant, which is what we call those eastern shores of the Mediterranean. So you move from villages where the poor live in small houses of clay versus the city dwellers who are living in tenement-style housing. Now, a domus is what was referred to as a large house or a large facility where one family lived, versus the poor would be living in apartments called seneculi. And that comes from the term insula, which is, again, a rectangular plot of land, which eventually evolved into an apartment block. Now, Rome is very crowded by the 4th century. In fact, you can only find one private home, domus, for every 26 blocks of apartment houses. And there were two types of insulae of apartments. You have within them, okay, so outside of a regular private citizen's home, that term domus is also used for a single family luxury flat. So think of something akin to a penthouse. Now, it might not necessarily be on top, but that kind of a setup. And then at the bottom level, you'd have the tabernae, which is small shops. And many times the small shops would have a loft, a single loft for the owner. So you have all these multiple dwellings within this one building. So you'd have the rich and the middle class and the very poor all living together. And these multiple floors were able to be built because the Romans developed concrete, opus caementicum. Now, you have this picture in your minds now of the differences between what village life would look like and what city life would look like. And so when the apostles go there to teach, they're meeting in these apartments. And in the apartments, they're able to reach not only the poor, the middle class, but also the rich. So you might have a master and a slave coming all together to hear the words of the apostles. So apartment buildings in the New Testament had very few comforts. There was no natural lighting except through large windows. And we know that in the book of Acts chapter 20, Eutychus actually falls through the window. And the windows aren't covered with glass. They're not using glass at this time, so it would have been covered with shutters or cloth or skins. There's no heating, there's no furnace, there's no fireplace, there's no chimney for venting. So cooking takes place on these small braziers, and any kind of warmth is based on the amount of clothing that you can afford to wear. There's also a lack of water to these apartment levels, and that results in poor hygiene. So if you could afford it, you would use the house aquarii. So each building had a slave that was called an aquarii who would bring water to the buildings. There's a lack of sewage and drainage because it's not connected to the Roman sewage system. So your chamber pots were thrown into trenches and collected by manure merchants for fertilizer. Now, public toilets are used by the poor if they can afford it for a small fee, and it's an open, as I showed you earlier, it's a very social place. The men also had access to open air urinals, so you'd find these urinals placed before the different doorways. And the urinals, the urine is collected, the alkali is collected for washing clothes and also curing leather. Excuse me. Now, nighttime tends to be very dark, and everyone stays inside, as we notice in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, when he talks about the bridegroom, the bride, and the bridesmaid. So if you do tend to go out at night, it's very important to take that extra oil with you in order to get back safely. Because you can imagine crossing these open trenches and whatnot, and it's pitch black because there's no lamps out there, there's no street lights. And on top of that, apparently Roman law was such that construction traffic and merchants are only allowed to move their goods at night. So it becomes very, very noisy. So it's smelly, it's noisy, it's crowded, it's quite dangerous. And this is what the city life was for those thousands of people who lived in Roman cities. It's very difficult for the poor. So here's an example of a reconstructed Roman apartment. If you ever have the opportunity to visit Turkey and you take one of the Footsteps of Fall trips and you get to Ephesus, they excavated one of these Roman apartment buildings so you can actually see the different levels and visit and see this beautiful very wealthy domus versus one where a poor person would live, all in the same building. It's an incredible excavation. So these architectural remains and these the archaeological excavations that we've looked at now provide us with a picture of what the ancient world was like as it reflects the various elements of culture and society, including religion, government, laws, art, and socioeconomic status, all of which go to create a civilization. So Roman and Hellenistic influence were pervasive throughout many areas of the Holy Land, and they had a significant impact on the peoples in the area. Jewish people frequently were caught in the tension of living their faith in an increasingly hostile pagan world. And early Christians would experience similar tensions, both from the pagans and the Jews, ultimately leading to a period of intense persecution. The appeal of Christ's message to the masses was critical. So the apostles were vital in sharing and spreading that gospel message. Their movements and their ability to travel throughout the Roman Empire and bring that message had a huge impact in a society which gave little value to human life. That Christian message of a loving, caring God provided comfort and hope to the masses. Our reflection questions for this lecture include: 1, how does knowledge of architecture and city layouts of the biblical world enhance your understanding now of biblical events? 2, if you were a Christian missionary during New Testament times, would you prefer life in a village or life in a city, and why? And 3, how did Roman rule help the spread of the good news? Well, thank you for joining me for this lecture. God bless you and have a great day.